Good morning. Well, I think I'd like to recognize that this is a very difficult time to be alive in many different ways. However, it's also a very exciting time to be alive if you are a fan of Marvel Comics and Star Wars. I mean, think about the power of all these things that I kind of grew up with the power and the resources of Disney, and now they're regularly pumping out new content, retelling the old stories of beloved characters, and even telling new aspects of these stories. You see, in some cases, we get to find out what happened after all the stories that we know and love. But in many cases, they're going back and going to what happened beforehand. And we learn the backstory. We learn all about these heroes. Where did they come from? What happened to them? What went into the process? What were the circumstances? What were the choices? What were the chances? How did it all happen? And I think we just love to learn from others and be inspired by their story and what brought them to where they are. And that's what we're going to deal with today as we talk about a hero of the faith. Now, even if you're not deeply knowledgeable about him, you have certainly heard of Moses, even if it was as portrayed by Charlton Heston, right? We've all heard of this guy who led a group of people out of slavery in Egypt, who stood by the Red Sea, talked to God, and it parted, and kind of led them through the wilderness experience. All this wild stuff. We've heard about him receiving the 10 Commandments and just delivering this beleaguered people who were also redeemed by God to the point where they could be ready for the promised land. But the question we want to look at today is, how did Moses become a redeemer? And what we're going to look at is two important ingredients. This may not be all that there is that goes into it, but definitely two things that are important that go into raising up a redeemer. We're going to look at this as we get Moses' backstory. But while we look at that, I want us to think about, I want you to think about today your life. And you may not, we may not ever be as famous as Moses, and that may not happen to us. But know this, every single generation, God talks to people and appoints people and invites them to be a part of his purposes, to be used as redemptive agents in his time. And I think it's important to think there's no reason that can't be you, even if it's in a highly visible way or if it's a behind the scenes way. But what we're going to look at is that these ingredients are also going to be part of our story if we want to be redeemers in the challenging but exciting times that God has called us to live in. So, with that said, let's go into, we're continuing in our series through Exodus. Let's go to Exodus chapter 2 and beginning in verse 1. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sisters stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse this baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." The first thing we want to look at that goes into raising up a redeemer that is absolutely essential is the sacrifice of others. Now, as we said as we started this series last week, that our focus in the book of Exodus, one of the big themes and our focus for this series is the redemption of people. Now, last week, we took a look and saw how the nation of Israel had come to be oppressed and had found itself in slave labor. And with this paranoid Pharaoh, they found all of a sudden that their children were in danger. And he ordered the murder of every male baby that was born because he was afraid that these people were going to come and turn his kingdom upside down. So his paranoia and fear led to this murderous decree. Now, where we left things were very bleak. And that's kind of the context of the chapter and why we see Moses' mom doing the things that she's doing and what's happening here. But one of the things that's important for us to remember that we talked about last week is that even in dark and difficult times, God is still up to something. God is still doing something. And sometimes we can't see that because our focus is so much on the difficulties. But sometimes when we step back, we say, God's hand is still working. And that's what we see here. You see, one of the ways God was working is he chose up a person who he wanted to basically raise up a redeemer through, someone that he could work through. And in this chapter, we see, we're going to see what raising up a redeemer requires, what goes into it. And again, this is Moses' backstory. Remember, at this point, he hasn't begun that, we like hearing him on Sinai with this deep, intimate relationship with God. He hasn't had any of those, experiences yet. God has not introduced himself to him. We're going to get into that next week. It's going to be awesome. But none of that has happened. So just understand this is where he is. And so remember, heroes and redeemers don't know in the moment of difficulty that God is preparing them for something greater. It makes sense in hindsight. But listen, if we want to be redemptive agents, it's important for us, whatever we're going through, to trust that God's hand is here in everything that we do today so that we can be part of God's redemptive plan tomorrow. And it's important for us to keep this in mind. Now, we've been talking a lot about a redeemer. What does a redeemer mean? So in the idea of biblical redemption, it is the idea of deliverance or setting someone free from some sort of evil by a payment or a price. So we're going to need to keep that in mind. That's important. And we know that God is the ultimate redeemer and that Jesus, our Redeemer, paid the price to deliver us from sin, evil, and death. And so that's awesome. But God also raises up little r redeemers, his people, who he calls up to do his work of redemption through, men and women. And here's what we have to remember. When God does this, heroes, we see this in all the stories we love, we see this in real life, heroes always pay a price, don't they? But they're not the only ones who pay a price, which is important that when we look at what it takes to raise up a redeemer, we have to pay attention to the sacrifice of others. You know that a hero is never a solo man or a solo woman performing the big, heroic feats that everybody sees and applauds. See, the truth is that every redeemer has to give credit to and acknowledge the contributions of those who have, who do, or who will, through their sacrifices or investments, make what they do possible. Now, in Moses' case, the people who sacrificed for him to make everything possible was a group of women, particularly his moms. Now, moms, on Mother's Day, I want to acknowledge and I want you to hear and be reminded that it is your constant, consistent sacrifices and investments into your children that help them to become the people they are and have opened them up to the opportunities that they have. I can tell you that, whoever I am or whatever God has used me to do is largely attributed to the faith and sacrifice of my mother, who poured herself out for me, and I am so thankful for you. By the way, hi, Mom. Thank you for watching every week. I appreciate that and love you. And I know that for moms, it's just sometimes we don't always see that, but it's important that you remember that. And God sees your sacrifices, and they count, and they matter. And listen, I want you to also know, as Crystal was saying, I know that this is a hard day on Mother's Day for many people, and maybe your mom it was sacrificial, and that part of the challenge is she's just no longer with you. And I'm sorry, and as she said, we're praying for you today. But what I also want you to maybe do is take the time to acknowledge and think of all the sacrifices and investments she made for you, and thank God that you did have that season, and he did choose her to pour into your life. But listen, Moses' mother, if you think about it, and sometimes it's like sometimes moms can feel invisible in everything that they're doing. Think about this. Moses' mother isn't even named in this chapter. You want to hear something worse? Moses wrote this book. Think he's in trouble on Mother's Day? But listen, it comes out later, so we can't give him too much trouble, but we find out later her name was Jochebed, and Jochebed was one of the Hebrew women who were living under the weight of slavery in Egypt and living under the threat of infanticide, as Pharaoh decreed that now every male baby that's born has to be immediately thrown into the Nile River. So when Jochebed had a baby boy, instead of it being a time of celebration, there was now all of a sudden she was thrust into a time of great dread because she was faced with this situation where the law of the land required her to kill the boy that God had blessed her with. But, as we read, when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. Now, the word fine is better translated, as we see in the New Living Translation, as special. She saw he was special. And I know almost every mom thinks their child is more special than everyone else. You know that first word, oh my gosh, he's a prodigy. You know, like they walk, he's going to be an Olympian, right? I get that. We see things in our kids, and that's a good thing. And look, everyone does. Like my mom, she's my biggest fan. And I don't know why. The only thing that I've been able to factor out is that I'm her only child. So like, she's got to double down on me. Like there's no other choice. And it's kind of one of the ones. But nonetheless, Jochebed saw something special in her son, and she named it, and she called it out. Moms, dads, never underestimate the value of seeing the special, the good that God has imparted into your kids and naming it and calling it out and drawing it out of them. And yes, of course, we're going to name the not so good things and the troubled behavior, and we're going to have to deal with that too. But make sure that we help them see the good and the special. Now, Moses' mom saw that he was so special that she took a big risk, talking about this idea of sacrifice. She risked her life to hide Moses for 3 months in defiance of his murderous orders. But when she couldn't do it any longer, she constructed a basket that she hoped would be waterproof and put Moses inside the basket and put him into the dangerous water of the Nile River. So technically, she was obeying Pharaoh. And then Moses' sister kept an eye on the basket as it began drifting down the Nile River to see what would happen, and she witnessed a fortuitous set of circumstances, which some might call luck, but I would call the hand of God. It says, Pharaoh's daughter went to bathe in the Nile, and she saw the basket. And so, she sent her servants over to find out what was going on, and they discovered this baby that was there in a basket, and it was crying, and the text says she had compassion on the baby. I mean, she knew it was one of the babies that her dad had ordered to be slaughtered, but she had compassion. And just as she's looking at this child, just then Moses' sister, who had been watching from a distance, appeared and said, hey, if you'd like, I'd be happy to run along and find one of these Hebrew women to nurse this boy, who I don't know and never met. You know what I mean? I'm sure she doesn't volunteer, hey, I'm a sister. And so, remarkably, Pharaoh's daughter says, yeah, that would be great. And then so Moses' sister, probably unbeknownst to Pharaoh's daughter, goes and gets Moses' mom. And then Pharaoh's daughter says, hey, all right, we found a lady. I'll pay you to take this child and nurse him. How cool is that? All of a sudden, reunited, and you're taking care of it. Now she's on Pharaoh's payroll. God is so good about doing things and orchestrating circumstances in a way we never could have imagined. And when that season was done, when he got a little bit older, Pharaoh's daughter sent for Moses, and then she raised him up, essentially became his stepmom. And by the way, this is another sacrifice, another investment. I know for many of you, maybe stepfathers, stepdads, or maybe you have adopted and taken a child into your home. And I think that's a wonderful way to be a redemptive agent. And I just think as the body of Christ, we need to see so much more of this, looking out for children for whatever set of circumstances need somebody. And I think that's a great way. But it's not just in this way that we can sacrifice for the benefit of others. How many maybe of us haven't adopted, and yet we have spiritually adopted people? Maybe you have your friends' kids come over and you invest and pour into them and raise them up in different ways. Or maybe spiritually speaking, do you know that you can, in a sense, be a spiritual mother or spiritual father and invest in somebody. And it doesn't mean you have to have it all figured out. It just means that you've come a little further than someone else, taken a few steps in a specific area, and that you're willing to take your time and sacrifice that and pour it in for the benefit of someone else. You know, just yesterday, I was saddened to learn that one of my heroes of the faith, Pastor John Shinelli, he's a pastoral care pastor at Calvary Fort Lauderdale, went home to be with Jesus. And thank God, I know he's in a much better place. But I look back, and when I joined that staff, and I just look back, and now I'm like, man, what a scrub I was. And yet he said, I want him in my department. And he pulled me in his pastoral care department and invested in me, poured into me, and really helped shape me and a whole bunch of my friends who are doing all different kinds of ministry to this day. And so never underestimate the value and the impact that you can make by adopting someone, not only physically, but spiritually speaking. And so Pharaoh's daughter called him Moses because she drew him out of the water. And his name literally means drew out. Now, God's hand was all over this, drawing his chosen redeemer out of danger to prepare his special assignment, but he used these women who made sacrifices to draw him out. And recognize in the same way, when God uses you to do special things, recognize the sacrifices that others have made along the way. One of the best things you can do if you have some kind of success in life in some area is go home today and make a list. Instead of like patting yourself on the back, yeah, I know you did hard work and took chances and all that kind of a thing, but make a list. Who helped contribute to you being there today? And thank God that he put them in your life. And I'm sure you'll find that that's a really good list. In the same way, recognize if God has chosen you to do special things, you know, again, there's this whole group of people, but also you're not always going to be the focal point like Moses. Sometimes you're one of those people who are sacrificing, but you get to play an important part too. Wasn't Moses' mom an important part of the story? Wasn't Pharaoh's daughter an important part of the story? Absolutely, their part mattered. And listen, you can play a part too, even if you're not highly visible. Now, last week, I was in the service, and I gave the invitation to follow Jesus, and I saw a woman raise her hand and accept Jesus for the first time in her life, and I've had that privilege many times, and it never gets old, and it's an exciting thing. And I got to meet her last week, got to make sure she had a Bible in her hand, I got to congratulate her on this great decision that she made. And listen, God is the one that saved her. It's his work, but he did get to use me in a small way to offer a prayer. But listen, so many other people were involved in this. So many other people sacrificed to show up early, to set up a physical environment, this stage and equipment and so many things so that we could meet. So many people prayed to create a spiritual environment, an anticipation of God doing good things. So many people on the hospitality team greeted and gave a warm smile, a hug, a handshake to make people feel that they are valued and friendly. So many people sacrificed to watch people's children, including this woman's in Calvary Kids, so she could come and hear what God wants to say to her today. So many people gave financially so that we could buy Bibles and do the work of ministry and do all the things that God has called us to do. And there's so many more. Listen, all of our sacrifices can be used by God for his redemptive purposes. Behind every Moses, there's a whole team of other people sacrificing and investing to do God's work. And it doesn't matter if you're visible. It doesn't matter if you're on the front lines. You can still make a difference. Your sacrifice and investment in others is all part of God's redemptive story, and every part matters. So we see in Moses' life how God used the sacrifice of others to raise him up, but we also see then the second thing we're going to look at today is how God uses seasons of preparation. Let's go back to Exodus 2 and continue in verse 11. It says, one day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flocks. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered the flock. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, "Why have you returned so early today?" They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered his flock." "And where is he?" Reuel said to his daughters. "Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat." Moses agreed to stay with the man who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, "I have become a foreigner in a foreign land." If God is going to use you in a small way or a big way for his redemptive purposes, understand that there are going to be seasons of preparation that precede this time. You see that he's going to be doing things in us even as he prepares us to do things through us. And recognize that your desire to do good may be there before your readiness is. For example, who remembers Underoos? Right, those were the most awesome things. And so I remember I was a kid and I had Batman and Spider-Man Underoos. But one day I went outside, I had my jeans on, and you know how someone wears his underwear on the outside for some reason. So I put my Underoos on top of my jeans. I had the Batman shirt, I had a blue bath towel. I tied it around. It wasn't even Halloween. Like in the middle of the day, I went out like this. It's like 9 years old. And this woman comes up, "Hi, son, what are you doing?" "I'm out here fighting crime, ma'am." You know? And it's just like, have you seen a man in white makeup, green hair, smiles a lot, purple suit? And it's just like, no, I haven't seen this guy. And so I was out there looking like an absolute fool. And by the way, it's just in seasons, you know, I knew that I wasn't ready. I had a desire to do something good to help others, but I needed a little preparation. The older I got, I have given up dreams of becoming Batman, just so you know. Although I do still hope to be bitten by a radioactive spider. That seems like a little easier. That said, when we think about sometimes our readiness and it doesn't match our desire, understand that when we see Moses, God will still use you along the way for his purposes in seasons of preparation, and not maybe to the extent that you want, but he'll use you in those seasons. But there are experiences in these seasons while you're waiting that will refine you for greater ones. Now, there can be many different seasons that God walks you through, but today we're going to look at 3 seasons that God walks Moses through, some common ones, and that is discovery, difficulty, and dullness. Discovery. God has a great sense of humor and irony at times. Pharaoh was trying to destroy God's people by ordering the death and murder of their baby boys. So God decides through a divine set of circumstances to protect his Redeemer by actually bringing him in to Pharaoh's palace, where he would pay for him, and then there would be the choicest of food, the greatest of care, the highest quality of education that Moses would have benefited from, certainly far better than the slave labor that he would have been destined for if he wasn't murdered. And so if you think about the education is a great time of discovery, but it's time of not only discovering what's going on in the world and how things work, but it's also a time of learning about yourself. And college students, if you're here today, and I know I just talked to someone that's graduating and moving on, and see some of you other ones, or some of you I know are going off to college. My daughter's graduating this week. She's going off to college in the fall. And I just want to say a word to college students. We're so glad you're here. And as you think about and prepare yourself to be trained for whatever career God has for you, remember that you're not just learning stuff, you're also learning about yourself. You're learning about who you are and what makes you tick. And pay attention to these seasons. As your semester winds down, remember, God is still training you about you. And so Moses began to discover some things about himself in this process, what it is that drives him. And so he left the comforts of the palace life, and when he went out to where his people were, and when he watched, it bothered him to see how they were oppressed, how they were being treated. And one day he sees an Egyptian beating on one of his fellow Hebrew brothers. So he looked around, obviously not carefully enough, and thought that no one saw him, and he killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. So we'll come back to that, but part of what Moses was learning about himself was that he carried a sense of compassion, a burden for oppressed people, and an anger against injustice. And so this passion for justice in our world is a good quality. And many of us, we feel that growing inside of us, and we want to do something. And maybe we don't know what to do in the moment, and maybe we try to do something, we're clumsy, we kind of make a mess in the process. And certainly Moses discovered along the way that maybe as these passions that were growing inside of him that he were discovering, maybe he wasn't acting on them exactly the right way. And so he goes back and he goes the next day. And with his growing sense of injustice, he sees two guys fighting, and one of them is basically like, you ain't the boss of me. Like, what are you going to do, kill me like that Egyptian? And all of a sudden, that was like red flag. Moses didn't realize this. Moses was discovering this growing sense of care for his people and wanting to protect them, wanting to shepherd them, but not quite ready to. And he's confronted by these two questions. Number one, who made you the ruler and judge over us? Now, ironically, God was going to do exactly that. But it wasn't in this place, so he was kind of like stepping out. God was having him on this path. It was the trajectory of his life, and he sensed this passion for his people and this concern and passion for justice, and he wanted to do what he could do now. But he realized, and what we have to realize is that in this process of discovering about ourselves, that there is also a season of refinement many times before God brings us to that place. Many of you guys know that I used to work for a place where it was residential ministry for men dealing with drug and alcohol addictions coming out of jail and prison, and met some of the most amazing people, and so their stories are still amazing of what God has done and used them in powerful ways. Some are pastors and ministers now, and it's really cool. But one day we had this guy Jose come, and Jose was a Cuban man, maybe 5 feet max, like with tall boots on, kind of a thing. Now, as a short guy, I love to be around Jose because, I'm always the one usually looking up to all of the rest of you guys. But Jose was there, and he had this sort of like high-pitched voice. Jose had a hard time following the rules. And so like I'd come, and he'd be in common areas where he's not supposed to have like food and beverages and stuff. I'm like, Jose, what are you doing? And his high-pitched voice, Bill, I'm drinking Malta. And, it's just kind of like one of those things, like just kind of do whatever he wanted to do. And then one day I came home, and I was like, all the guys are missing. I'm like, what's going on? And I look outside, and Jose's got like all the chairs set up, and he dragged our pulpit from inside, and he was preaching to all the guys outside. And I'm like, Jose, what are you doing, man? And he's like, Bill, I have baptized everyone, and now I am preaching to them. And I'm like, by the way, from that day, his nickname became Jose the Baptist. But one of the things as we began to talk to Jose the Baptist was, listen, my brother, I see God stirring something in you, but we're trying to keep you off of drugs and alcohol right now, right? We're trying to keep you out of jail and out of prison. And I want to confirm what God is doing, but please stop taking the guys out in the back in the river and dragging our, it was this whole process. Now, I'm fully convinced Jose somewhere, God bless him, in Miami, is a pastor today. I don't know that for sure, but I trust that he's out there doing all that stuff. But you see, sometimes in certain seasons, we feel this discovery of God wanting to do something even though we're not with us. And so Moses gets this second question. Someone asks him, are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? Oh my gosh, you imagine how shocked and terrified that Moses was, sensing like, oh my goodness, my secret is known. And you see, sometimes our passion for whatever God is showing us pushes us out in front of our skis when it comes to our maturity and character, and we can make a mess of things. And that's certainly where Moses finds himself. But this overlaps with another season of preparation that Moses learns, and that is seasons of difficulty. How many know that seasons of difficulty prepare you for future circumstances that you're going to face? When Pharaoh heard what was going on and that, hey, he killed an Egyptian, how dare he, the audacity of this guy. And so he goes out and he tries to kill Moses. And so now Moses, who was living in the lap of luxury, all of a sudden finds himself on the run once again under threat of Pharaoh. And then so he ran and he took refuge in Midian, alone and on the run. Now every hero is forged and refined in the crucible. There are just some difficult events or some circumstances that shape the person that they become. And sometimes these are outside of our control. Sometimes they maybe are the results of the choices we make, or even clumsily, like Moses, trying to do the right thing. But what every Redeemer knows is that many times doing the right thing, trying to go forward and do what God has shown you to do and the right thing costs you. Helping others often comes at your own expense. It's again, and I think don't worry, it's the last comic book reference today. But you think of Spider-Man. It was my favorite growing up, and it seems like every other issue he was like wrestling with. I don't want to do this anymore because my Aunt May or my Mary Jane are in danger, and I can't provide and I can't do these things. And so there was always this cost, this difficulty of doing that, and we find this in life. And so with Moses, his difficulty came down to a decision. Again, if he wanted to protect the life that he had, the nice, comfortable life, he could have shut his mouth. He could have just turned a blind eye and buried his feelings to the plight of these people and not done anything about the injustice and the feelings that were stirring inside of him. He could have just turned around and walked away, pretended that never happened, and he could have enjoyed a life of comfort, pleasure, and plenty. And by the way, we probably never would have heard of Moses. And so it would have been a short-term game. But by faith, he chose the harder path. As Hebrews says in the New Testament, looking back to Moses, it says this, Hebrews 11:24-25, it says, by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. Moses chose this path by faith. He chose what matters eternally over temporary pleasures and comforts. You see, this is something that we have to wrestle with if we want to be used by God, to be redemptive agents in this world, that if we want to do something that matters, that sometimes it may cost us the life we knew. It may cost us the life of comfort, the life that we become accustomed to, and doing things the way that we've always done. What we find is we may step into something difficult, and all of a sudden it costs us. But here's what I want to promise you is that it may be difficult, but whatever God does is outweighed as we give up these things in an act of faith. In other words, the idea that we can be used for purpose in God's word is far greater than whatever we might have to give up. And again, recognize that these seasons of faith, these seasons of difficulty that God takes us through, they're doing something inside of you. They're strengthening you, building your character, refining you. How many people have you met that have done amazing things in this world that didn't have some kind of hardship story that God used to make them grow deeper? As we saw last week, recognizing that even in this process, even in the crucible, God is always at work. He's doing good things even in difficult seasons. So one day, the daughters of the priest of Midian went down they were shepherds, and so they went to water their sheep, and some shepherds came along to run them off. But it says that Moses came to their rescue and watered their flock. So we see that, again, Moses is leaning into his discovery. Pretty much we see by now he's a rescuer, right? He's going to step in and try to intervene. He's a person who looks after people, does not like to see people mistreated. He's going to step up. It's just part of who he is. It's part of his recurring theme. And so this turns into, the lady's like, okay, thanks. They go home to Ruel, their father. And he's like, what happened? Why are you back so early? Oh, this guy came and did this. He's like, well, what? Why? Where is he? Go back and get him and bring him here. And then all of a sudden, he tells Moses, well, listen, you can have my daughters, Zipporah and Mary, and that's a great thing. So listen, in some of our darkest times, God provides some of our greatest blessings. But once again, to see them, sometimes we have to step back from our difficult circumstances and ask God to give us eyes to see. God, I see these difficulties. I see this pain. You know my frustration. It takes up my prayers. It takes up my thoughts, my worries, all of this. But I want to step back and say, what cool things are you doing right now as well? What blessings are you providing right now? And it's just important to see. And so we see that for Moses, he was running. He was alone, and he was just under this threat. And all of a sudden, God comes along and provides a family. Clearly, it's a great blessing, but it's also a transition to our third season of preparation, and that is dullness. I know how bad that sounds, making marriage and family a transition to dullness, but I need you to hear me out. That's not what I'm talking about. Families are not dull, believe me. When we think of a hero, when we think of a redeemer, you know what we think of? We think of the epic battles. We think of the antagonist being defeated. We think of the hero swooping down to rescue the person that's in distress. We think of the big moments. Those are the fun things, the exciting things, the big moments. But in order to get to those, we have to go through the seasons of dullness. Now, these seasons aren't necessarily difficult, but they are dull. Nothing seems to be happening. There's no epic battles. It's just kind of the same old, and we might even begin to feel a sense of the drudgery of life. And so many times, we just want to, where's the remote? How do I fast forward through this part? It's really boring. But we can't do that. And God doesn't want you to do that. We have to recognize that even in seasons of dullness, God is at work too. Listen, maybe he's teaching you patience. Maybe he's teaching you faithfulness. Maybe he's teaching you how to continue to take care of your responsibilities, your family, whatever it is, over a long, consistent stretch of time. And again, what you may not realize is that even in seasons of dullness, God is preparing you and equipping you for redemptive seasons too. Think about this. Moses spent the next 40 years in this season of preparation, where he is right there with his family, before the big events begin to happen that we see unfold. And so here he is hanging out with shepherds all of a sudden, doing shepherd things. Now, I'm not a shepherd, and if any of you are, this is not to insult you, but it doesn't seem like it'd be very exciting, right? Like, it doesn't seem like there'd be a lot going on. In fact, Moses, you could begin to imagine that after his prestigious education in the finest schools of Egypt, and then after his discovery, and he realized that he has a passion, and he is a rescuer, and he wants to help other people and do big things. Could you imagine how frustrating this season may have been for him at many times? Maybe he felt like his life was wasting away. Maybe he felt like he missed his moment. This is what it is. But check out this note from the Bible Knowledge Commentary about this section of Scripture. It says, for 40 years, and we see that in Acts 7:30, by the way, for 40 years, Moses undertook the toilsome life of a shepherder in the Sinai area, thus gaining a valuable knowledge of the topography of the Sinai Peninsula, which later was helpful as he led the Israelites in that wilderness land. See what God was doing? Through shepherding sheep in a season of dullness, Moses gained an intimate knowledge of the land through which he would later be shepherding people. And with using all the sense of a rescuer, using all the things that God had put inside of him, God was using this season too. Moses had no clue that all those dull nights were part of his redemptive training. Moms, dads too, but especially moms because it's Mother's Day. But Dad, I got you in a few weeks. We'll get there. But listen, when we think about your kids, and we maybe think about school, work, and for any of us, whatever we're doing, maybe sometimes in certain seasons, it can feel a little bit dull after a while. Like, okay, what was exciting at first, but now we're kind of in a pattern. And what I want to encourage you, if you're in a season of dullness now, is to maybe stop and ask yourself and ask God the question, God, what is it you are preparing me for? Now, even asking the question, God may not give you an answer. I don't think Moses got to know until he saw, but even the fact that you're asking the question is an act of faith, trusting that God is doing something, and then you'll later on be able to see it. You know, in my life, I've found that nothing gets wasted. God has used all the seasons in my life, the education, the experiences, the seasons of discovery. He's used the seasons of difficulty in my life, many seasons I wish had never happened, and yet God made me more usable because of them. He's used the seasons of dullness that include certain jobs where I'm like, oh man, here I am day in, day out, changing one life at a time. Help me, Jesus, out. And you know what? God used the training in those seasons. God used the experiences in those trainings. He uses everything. He uses everything that's part of there. If we'll put it in his hands, he can redeem it and put it in the toolbox that are used for his redemptive purposes. And listen, the same is true with you. Remember, if God is calling you to be a redeemer, and I believe he's calling all of us to do that in some way, shape, or form, even if it's to help others or be a part of a thing, then you are being prepared in advance to handle these moments in seasons of discovery, in seasons of difficulty, and in seasons of dullness. God is doing a work. Now, how he's going to use all this, God only knows, right? We don't know the answer to that, but we trust that in time, if we persist, we'll find out. Now, we're almost done, but let's just finish this chapter, last couple of verses, and then kind of wrap it up. We're just going to quickly turn back into what God is doing with his people. We focused on Moses and his life, so let's zoom out and finish the chapter looking at what he's doing with the rest of the people of Israel. It says, during that long period, the king of Egypt died, so circumstances changed. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help, because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. See, Pharaoh dies, but God's people remained enslaved and oppressed. Nothing changed in that same. And they cry out to God, and God hears them. He hears their cries. He remembers the promises that he had made through Abraham and the covenant. And it says he looked on them, and he was concerned about them. I want you to receive that too today. I don't know what you're going through today, but know that God knows what you're going through. God hears your cries today. And God, your ultimate Redeemer, is concerned about you too. And he already may be preparing a Redeemer to come help you out. He may be already preparing you to be a Redeemer for somebody else. And we certainly know that he has already raised up a Redeemer in Jesus who redeemed you in his blood and saved you not only to do a good work in you, but also to do a great work through you. And at this time, what I want to do is I want to just close us in prayer with this thought in mind and begin to ask yourself, in what season are you in today, and what is God doing in you? And then just begin to dream about what he's going to do ahead. And I want to pray for you in a moment, but I also want to pray for those of you that you came today and you haven't had this redemptive experience with Jesus. As we said, a biblical redeemer, is someone who sacrifices or pays a price in order to liberate. And so that's exactly what Jesus did for us. You see, you and I, we were stuck. We were under the slavery of sin. We maybe not Pharaoh, but we do certain things that we can't stop doing. We're stuck in this pattern, thinking, acting, doing the wrong thing. And we're told that it leads to our death, and that this is the path that we are all born into and all on. And yet God did not want that, so God raised up a Redeemer in his Son. He sent Jesus to come to this world, to die on the cross, to give his life for us, so that through his blood, that could be the redemptive payment so that we can be set free and experience new life in Jesus, and then have the privilege of being used by God to do great things in this world. Now, this all begins with you simply accepting this great work. And so what I want to do is, first of all, ask every head to be bowed, every eye to be closed. And I'm going to invite you to say a prayer, just like I and many in this room have done over the years, where you could just maybe say this prayer to God today, and he will hear you, and he will begin this relationship with you that he initiated in Jesus. And if that's you today, with every head bowed and eye closed, if you want to say that prayer with me quietly in the seat that you're in right now, just raise your hand real quick, and I'll say that prayer with you in a moment. You could just, and I see your hand. I just as you talk to God, these are words that I'm going to offer, but it's your heart that you're offering to him today. Just say, dear God, I thank you for sending Jesus to be my Redeemer. I pray that you'd forgive me of the wrong, sinful things that I've done and do, and help me receive your gift of salvation and redemption through Jesus today and the great cost he paid. Just as Jesus rose from the dead, help me to die to an old way and live for a new way in Jesus. In your name, amen. Now, to those who prayed that prayer, congratulations. In just a moment, we're going to talk about how we can put a Bible in your hands.